Hello everyone and welcome back. This is a video that is a long time coming. I've had this idea for a while. I've been working on it as one of these reading projects I've been working on for a while, and I'm finally getting around to it. I feel like I finally read enough that I can, start talking about it. Today we're talking about Richard Brautigan. We're not talking about him in the sense of his own work and his life, maybe a little bit of his life, but not his specific writing. We are going to be talking about Richard Brautigan through the writing of his friends. Now, this is an interesting concept. This is something that I think is a really a unique way of exploring an author. So I think, everyone has their favorite authors and favorite works. And when you get to that, you start with your reading their initial big books, and you get hooked on that. And then maybe you read some of their lesser known stuff and you really like that, but you want more. You start to learn a little bit about their personal life and, for better or for worse. I'm not going to say I'm necessarily a fan of Richard Brautigan, the man, but Richard Brautigan, the works, pretty great. And so from there, where do you go once you've kind of learned a little bit about a specific person? Well, you start to find out some things about them. Now, the works of Richard Brautigan, I guess I should say, what inspired this is actually the first book on my bookshelf. These are all alphabetized. What inspired it? I read this about this time last year. This is Downstream from Trout Fishing in America. It looks very much like a Richard Brautigan book. This is by Keith Abbott. This is a biography that Keith Abbott wrote and I believe he published this in 1989. So about 4 years after Brautigan's death. It's about the length of a Richard Brautigan novel. So it's only 170 pages. There's not a lot to it. It's mostly, Richard Brautigan's life through the lens of Keith Abbott. So he's talking about him, how he knew him, which is a great resource. I'm not bemoaning any of that. I think that the greatest resource in here is learning about Richard Brautigan as the man, as a friend, and some of the components of that. Like their weird, quirky interactions. And so it's great for that, but it's not a great, all-encompassing biography in that aspect. But this was one of the first official things kind of released after his death, and Keith Abbott really wanted to give him, a proper overview, a more respectful one. And as I'm looking at the back of this book, you get a nice photo of Richard Brautigan out in the middle right there. And you get all these other people around him at this table. And those are his friends, and some of which we're going to talk about today. Keith Abbott, we're not talking really too much about aside from this book. He didn't really write too much this is probably like the most popular thing he's written. And this is a great Brautigan. This is the rarest of Brautigans when you think of the photos. It's a great photo. But on the back here, I'm just let me see who all we've got named here. We got Tom McGuane, not Thomas McGuane, but Tom McGuane, Jim Harrison, Bill Roedicker, Becky McGuane, the wife of Mr. Tom, and Dink Bruce. And so we're going to talk about a couple of those guys, but this is a very iconic photo when you think about the Brautigan friends. There's some other photos in this book too. Like any great Brautigan book and biography, there are some rare Brautigans. Why can't I find any of them now? There we go. We got a good one. The craziest rare Brautigan, if you've never seen this before, is young Brautigan, in my opinion. Where you're like, who is this man? He looks unrecognizable, but at the same time, you still have a distinctive facial feature. So I read this book, and it gave me some ideas of, there's all these other guys. Richard Brautigan, for being a very introverted kind of person, very insular personal writing. He had a lot of friends, and he was a very social guy. So I thought, might as well explore who all those guys were. And I think it's a great way of looking into just what was going on in American literature at the time, at least in that scene, which is a pretty vast and really influential scene, if you really think about it, of the 60s, 70s, and even continuing to today in some stances. So that's about enough of Keith Abbott right here, but we're going to talk about some of the books I've read over the last year and just what we can learn from that. So the first up on my list was I found this book. I had heard this name in Downstream from Trout Fishing in America. I heard this name, William Hjortsberg, which that's quite a name, huh? You got this. This is a crazy cover. I read this back in January. I traded in some books at Myopic Books, and I got this. in which it's a nice hardcover. Published in 1971. This is William Hjortsberg was not necessarily a science fiction author, but this is a science fiction book. And my favorite year, we're going to get into this. This is another video I want to put together, is my favorite science fictions. 1971 really is my favorite year in terms of science fiction. I think there's something really crazy about that time period. The Hugo winner, To Your Scattered Bodies Go, by Philip Jose Farmer. It's my favorite kind of period. So I was well excited to read a science fiction book from a friend of Brautigan. That's why I picked up this one first. So starting off, this is a strong start. So Gray Matters, kind of a fun play as a title, right? Gray Matters is all about human consciousness, kind of brains in jars. It's a very simple way of putting it, but essentially it starts in that contemporary 70s time period, and it describes a couple characters that you follow along with, and what happens is they, for whatever reason, go into a coma or near death or whatever it might be, and their bodies are preserved until medical science can continue their lives. And so what essentially that does is it goes a couple centuries in the future. It apparently, Friday the 15th of October, we're coming up on that, 2425. What a crazy far out year. But some of these characters, they all start out in the 70s or so, and or even earlier really, but like around that time period is really when the story kind of starts. All these characters, they essentially, you learn about their like previous life, and then you learn about where they are as brains and consciousness. And that is a really cool concept for a science fiction book. Just kind of like, what is humanity? What can humanity be if you don't have a body? If your body doesn't really, it's not corporeal. Like, what is your existence? And it has a lot of these mental things, the mental visions. Are those real? Are those genuine? All that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of this, like, kind of the personality stuff that you might get in a Brautigan book, but very much more science fiction. Like I said, he's not necessarily a science fiction author. I think he wrote maybe one other science fiction book. Everything else, kind of all over the place, other stuff when it came to writing. This is the only Hjortsberg I've read so far. What I don't like about it is you get into the story, and like I said, I know this, getting into the territory of 1971 science fiction, you get a lot of weird sexual exploits and sexual fantasies played out by straight white men who have really crazy, weird ideas, and some of them, their ideas get ahead of them, and they can't write to keep up with it. So a lot of weird stuff plays out with this. What essentially the body, the mind consciousness stuff really just becomes, the horny emotions are really what takes the center stage, and it kind of takes over for the rest of the book. It's a little bit of a disappointment in that. I think the lead up and the beginning of this is super great just because the world building, it doesn't get you lost. It's not a very long book. I think this is similar to a Brautigan. It's 150, 160 pages. It's not very long. We get a nice photo of Hjortsberg here. Boy, look at that, a young Hjortsberg. I think it's something interesting. Don't know if I'd necessarily reread this. Don't know if I necessarily recommend it. I think if you're someone who's into science fiction, especially the time period, it's worth checking out just because this is such a weird no one's discussing this book because he's not a science fiction author that people know. And because of that, I think it could be good for someone who knows what they're into, but not a good starting point, especially if you're not into this kind of, if you're not familiar with the territory or the author. This was his second book that he ever published. So he's a very early on author, as you can tell by that photo, young man. There's a couple things I'm not going to leave it there with Hjortsberg, but that's what I'm going to leave it with Gray Matters. I found recently, about a month ago, and I don't have a dust jacket to it, but I found this at a thrift store. This, could you tell what it is? It is William Hjortsberg's Alp. Alp was his first novel, which is more of a satirical take on like Swiss European folklore kind of stories, fairy tales. I haven't read this yet. This is a similar length book of about 150 pages as well. This actually is a first edition. And I found this at the thrift store for $3 in suburbs. And it was probably the greatest thrift store book find I've ever found, if I'm going to be honest. I believe this is the first printing. And what is so great about this, though, is I'm going to get to it. I'm going to read this one eventually. But I've never seen the hardcover around, and unfortunately it doesn't have the dust jacket otherwise, and it's a little torn up in some of the back pages, but fully readable. And they haven't printed this. They haven't printed this one, and they probably shouldn't. But and I don't know if they should print this one again either. But they haven't printed these since the 70s. Some of his later books took on a bigger acclaim. I think Falling Angel. I haven't read it yet, but that was written in the later 70s and turned into a movie. A lot of these guys, they actually had the opportunity to. They were some of the first generation of authors who really came about when the movie business really was becoming big. And screenwriting, like that's really how you made your money as an author, as a writer, is writing movie screenplays. And so all these guys that I'm going to talk about, most of them, all the guys I think, are screenwriters. And that's really how they made their acclaim. And honestly, some of these names, if you talk to certain people, are bigger than Brautigan for that reason. Also for the fact that they lived a little bit longer, if not a lot longer. And yeah, it's just interesting. When I read the Downstream from Trout Fishing in America, I learned that Brautigan was posed to turn one of his books into a movie. And that is, I have a new edition of this, so it's kind of fun to show off, is Hawkline Monster. I found a hardcover because all the other 70s books I have of his are hardcovers, and so it's nice to have a matching set, thanks to My Epic Books. Shout out twice for this. Oh, and also, nice. That's one of the best Brautigans, the mailbox one. He was set to turn this into a screenplay. He did. He wrote a first draft, and apparently he submitted that to the studios. This is all according to Mr. Downstream. Was set to produce this as a movie. He wrote his first draft, submitted it, and they said, hey, this is great. This is, we're excited. We want to produce this. You got to, rewrite this, though. You just got to work on it a little bit more. And he was just so taken aback by that and was just like, well, I'm not, it's done. It's my story. I did it. And he was not willing to compromise on that. There's a lot of the childish immaturities. You learn a lot about that in the Downstream. Just kind of the downfalls of Brautigan as a personality and as a man. And that was just kind of an example of that. So this never became a movie. This is the only example, to my knowledge, of anything that he was poised to produce as a movie. And this script is still out there. I forget exactly who it's up to now, but even in the last 5 years, it's been passed around as a possibility of adaptation. So when it does, I haven't read this one yet, but I think in the next year I'm planning on reading this. So whether there's a movie or not, I'm going to be reading this. But it's exciting if there is. Okay, I think I got one more Hjortsberg. Okay, last thing I'm going to say on Hjortsberg, because this will take forever. I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I had the opportunity to be in Livingston, Montana, which has a bit of Brautigan history, and I acquired this book. This is a phone book size book. It feels like a phone book. It's a paperback. I didn't get the hardcover. This thing is a hefty fucking book. It really, it's 800 pages, and this is the definitive biography of Brautigan over here. He's in color. That's how you know. So you know it's definitive. And this is written by Hjortsberg. And in some ways, this is the most successful thing he's written. This came out in 2012. And I have yet to read this yet because I bought this in the middle of this project. I've kind of skimmed a few of the excerpts, but it's 800 pages. I think next year, this might be really what I take on. But, boy, that is there's so much text on a page. It's exciting, though. This is the most Brautigan you could engulf yourself in, because honestly it might take me longer to read this than it would to read all 13 of his books. He wrote this, and it's clear that he really wanted to go all in and provide everything there. And there are a lot of allusions to all these authors we're going to talk about today. From some of the stuff we kind of skipped around in, some of the pictures. Boy, that is a menacing Brautigan right there. Menacing. He's got all these great friends. But yeah, I was out in Livingston, Montana, and this was Black Elk bookstore, I believe, in Livingston, Montana. It was a great store. The guy there has a lot of first-hand knowledge of a lot of these guys we're going to talk about today. They would come in and they would do readings. There's a lot of copies of signed editions of some of these guys there. So if you're ever in Livingston, Montana, I highly recommend. A great place for Brautigan history. So I just wanted to bring up this. This is a reading project to come in the future. I think if I do a part 2 of this video, which I definitely will need to because there's so much more to talk about, especially, we got to read Alp, we got to read all these other ones. I will probably talk more about this book then. But I'll leave it at that because it'll take forever to get through all this. Next up, we got here a little bit of a curveball from what I'm going to talk about, because a lot of these guys, they kind of, get a little bit of a boys club. Big themes of a lot of their stuff. But right now I'm going to be talking about the next person I read, who has become, honestly, one of my favorite fascinations of this year. Favorite new author, and that is Miss Joanne Kyger. We got a photo in the back. Now, for this project, I wanted to read books that Brautigan would have read himself. And for the most part, I did that, and there's a couple exceptions that I'll talk about, and Joanne Kyger is definitely one of them. And that is only due to the fact that her books are so hard to find. They're mostly out of print, and the resale price on them is exorbitant. This is her last poetry collection. Now, Joanne Kyger was a poet. As you know, Brautigan wrote a lot of poems himself, and they met in San Francisco, in Bolinas, California, and in the late 50s. Became friends. They were part of a big part of the same scene. Joanne Kyger, she, like I said, she's just got an amazing, she, in some ways, better than Brautigan, especially as a poet, but just writing in general. She writes all these, what I like to describe as California Zen poems. Now, she was married to this guy who I get to read this book either. Once again, I can't read everything all at once, but this is Gary Schneider. Oh God, I'm covering it. Gary Schneider. She was married to him for a period of time, and so in some ways, if you're familiar with Gary Schneider, she kind of lives in the shadows of his legacy. But I think, I don't really have much to base it off of, but I think she's better. Joanne Kyger and Gary Schneider, they went to Asia back in the early 60s. They went to Japan, they went to India, and they did all that, 10 years, 15 years before Brautigan even stepped foot in Asia. And so she really got a good handle on a lot of the Zen things, the Zen practices that inspired her work, inspired a lot of the countercultural movement of the 60s, inspired Brautigan, all that kind of stuff. And when you read Brautigan, you get these kind of Zen feelings. This kind of, he's bringing up an emotion and then just finding its place in the world, and just finding contentment with it. That's a very big theme that you find here in Joanne Kyger's work. Now, I read one of her other books just recently, which actually is a little bit more Brautigan time period era, and it was great. It was I just think she's very much a 70s feel to her writing, but at the same time it's timeless in a way, and I think this book is a better example of that. It's a better in the way, the fact that it is written well after the 70s, yet it has still that Kyger feel to it that you would feel from decades prior. Now so on time, these are poems written from 2005 to 2014. This was published in 2015. This is the last thing she published through City Light. She's a long-standing City Light writer, and you can still buy it on their website today, and it's actually quite affordable to buy this. So I think this is a great introduction because it's accessible. These poems were written from, like I said, 2005 to 2014. It's an interesting era. What I was not expecting, because of what I was familiar with, there's a lot of great videos of Joanne Kyger reading. You can read poems online. People have posted the lines of them, and I was not expecting all the political stuff that's in here. Now, 2005, late 2000s, very much the Bush era, the War on Terror, and there's a lot of poems about that. It's kind of crazy. Now, I'm going to see if I can find any. I've got another video about poetry, so I'm going to save some of my Joanne Kyger talk and try to keep it to just this. But she writes all these poems, and she dates all of her poems. And you can look up what I thought was so amazing. There's a poem in here, and like I said, I'm going to save it for. I'll read this one. This is a favorite of mine. It's called The Olympic Torch in San Francisco, and this was written April 9th, 2008. So think about the 2008 Olympics. They drove out of town to the airport, the torch between their legs. The protection protected the runner so much you couldn't see them as they dodged around town to avoid those who wanted to say something fierce. Just think of the expense to keep them safe. Local police, state police, and the Chinese police, who were ready to snatch even the tiniest Tibetan flag out of a runner's hand and drag her out of the race. I had another one up my sleeve, she said. So that's a great poem, very political, very poignant, but also very accessible. It's the daily life. There's nothing too confusing or allegorical about it. And sometimes she gets a little bit more allegorical to it. But I think it's great. Some of these poems in here, you can look at the date and see what was in the news headline that day and just what inspired her. And I think that's really interesting and great to look at. You can tell though from reading that feels very much like a Brautigan poem. Just kind of like these short, quippy thoughts. They're very slice of life, which is kind of my favorite kind of poetry. And some of them get a little bit more, like I said, more technical than a Brautigan. That one feels a little bit more something he could have written. But I think what's great about reading this collection is it's like it helps me imagine like what would it be like if Richard Brautigan had lived to the 21st century and had written some stuff. I don't know if he necessarily would have been as political. I don't know, there's some stuff where I've read Tokyo, Montana, and that was published in 1980, and you get a little bit more of the modern technology and modern thought. And I can only imagine him continuing that into the 90s or further if he had stayed alive. So I'm going to leave it at Joanne Kyger for that, but she is a new favorite of mine. I'm going to talk more in the poetry video about it because that's really where she shines with that. The next author I read from Friends of Brautigan was Thomas McGuane. Now, I've got a couple Thomas McGuanes up here, and once again, this was a exception to my rule about reading books that Brautigan probably would have read. This book here, Keep the Change, first novel I've read by him. I read some short stories prior to this too. I read this over some of the other ones, some of the bigger names, because I was going to Livingston, Montana, and I had found this, and this book takes place in Livingston, Montana. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Thomas McGuane was a writer who, he had met Brautigan probably in the late 60s in San Francisco. Those guys traveled all around. Thomas McGuane himself is a very outdoorsy, very masculine man, kind of, doing a lot of stuff, outdoorsmanship, sportsmanship kind of stuff, the excitement of all that. And there's a great video. It's crazy that Yeti, the water bottle company, produced it, but it came out last year. It's a documentary about all these authors going to Key West and fishing there. And that's kind of where they meet Jimmy Buffett. Thomas McGuane is married to the sister of Mr. Buffett. And Brautigan was there. Jim Harrison, who we'll talk about in a little bit, was there. It's a great video if you want, it's a lot about McGuane, and that's kind of where I found out about him. Particularly is because he's the only living guy left, and so they interview him and he's telling a lot of the stories, so he really gets center stage. But it's really great. There's an interesting story where he brings up how Brautigan had come to his house. They lived together, not together, but they lived at the same time in the same town of Livingston, Montana, which is why I went out there. Among the fact that it's just a beautiful place to be, and I had never been to Montana or that part of the country, and I thought it was a great time. I can only recommend it enough. They lived in the same town, and there was a point where Brautigan came to his house and he gave Thomas McGuane a vase, a vessel. And he's told this story a couple times, Thomas McGuane, when he talks about Brautigan. But he says, "What's this?" And he says, "Oh, someone will call you when they want this. You'll know when you need it." And about a year later, someone called him, and that was when he learned that Richard Brautigan had committed suicide. And so that's just crazy. It's a crazy thing that that shows who Brautigan was, and it shows who Thomas McGuane was. That's the story he tells, and there is some absurdity and humor in the fact that everyone should kind of know that story, who cares and wants to know more about their lives. So to get to it though, I read this one. As you can tell by the cover, very Western cowboy. Thomas McGuane born in Michigan and kind of started writing some stories when he was out in Florida. It's the early Florida period. I've got some of those books. His arguably bigger books are from that period. I love these little editions. We've got Panama, which is very much a Florida one. Came out in the late 70s. And then we've got 92 in the Shade, which is arguably his biggest. Also turned into a movie. And I just love these editions, little penguins. It's minimalism at its best, and so 70s. So instead of reading those other two, what I ended up reading was Keep the Change. I found this at a thrift store, and I was really looking forward to something in anticipation of the trip to Montana to read that was kind of more Montana-based. So this came out in 1989, so it is after Brautigan's death. And I gotta say, I was not a huge fan of this. I think there's a lot of stories of McGuane's that are these kind of male idealism, exceptional fantasy kind of stuff. It's never too overtly sexual. I mean, he's got like, it's very adult in the term of like, these are adult relationships, these are adults. It's not very youthful in any way. We follow this character whose probably name is like Joe. Yeah, of course it is. I think the other Harrison book is Joe as well, because it's got to be an average Joe. And this guy, he grew up in Montana, and then he went off. He was too big, too good for it. Grew up on this ranch. He went off and he was a part of the space program. This is where it got a little too absurd for me. And they don't really talk about it that much, but it just feels like it's too much. You're playing too much into the fantasy right here. But he's a guy who grew up on he's a cool-headed, hard-working guy. There's a lot of stories about just working hard on the ranch. And, he was in the space program, and he's driving around the country. He's just doing all this cool stuff. And, he rekindles some old relationship flames from back when he was younger and he lived there. And, some of that stuff's fun. The writing's not too bad. It's a very short book. It's about 200 pages. 220, and the chapters are very short. I read half of this on the train going to and from work. It was great for that because you could read a chapter or two and then have to put it down. And then I read the other part while I was in Montana, and so that was great too. And it's great to kind of visualize a lot of the places that are mentioned in here. The town there's a fictitious town where a lot of his stories take place in. So that was not real, but you can imagine. I think a lot of it's based on Livingston. But a lot of the big stuff, like Billings, all those other big towns, very much based on real places. So it helped vivid. That was the most enjoyable part of me, for me, is kind of feeling like I'm there, feeling like I'm back there. Because I was reading this on the train after I got back from the trip. I was like, damn, it's like I'm still there. There's one chapter in here that I actually really liked as a literary piece, where Joe and his love interest are in bed, and they're just talking at the end of the day. And there's this whole conversation going back and forth, and then the perspective shifts, and there's a radio playing in the background, and it no longer is playing music, but it's playing a news program talking about the opening of a mall in Alberta or something like that. And all of a sudden, it's just describing everything. It's putting you in that mall, and you're like, wow, this story just jumped from, I was in a very detailed dialogue between two people in Montana to now I'm just like floating around this Alberta mall. And then it cuts back, and the chapter ends where it was like, and as the program ended, they were asleep. And I just thought that was a great chapter. The rest of this book, it was fine, but that chapter was great. And I do want to read more, so I'm going to read Panama. I'm going to read 92 in the Shade, but I don't know about this one. Next up, I read a book by a guy whose name is Jim Harrison. This is Farmer, and this was published in 1976. The reason I read this book is because there's a quote from Mr. Brautigan on the back. It is right here. It says, "Farmer is a sensitive, powerful love story about a man on the cutting edge of life. The characters are so real that often my eyes fill up with tears for their plight, their human helplessness." Richard Brautigan. Now that's a quote right on the back. So I thought, if I'm going to read a Jim Harrison book, because I knew that those guys were friends, and I'd heard a lot about stories, you hear about it in all these kind of biographies. Might as well read the one where he's quoted on the back as having read it. This book, surprisingly, this copy has been around in my possession, or at least around me and my peripheral, longer than pretty much everything on the shelf. Because this was sitting at my parents' house, and I remember seeing this spine on the bookshelf of adult books, books that my parents had, growing up. And I always remember seeing this very interesting 80s Delta edition. You got this picture of this guy in the back and his daughter, and which I think, we'll get to it, but I don't think this is a great photo to put on the back of this book. I think it's a very concerning, honestly, like, no one told you to put it otherwise. This was sitting at my parents', and when I learned I was going to read this book, and I was about to buy a copy, and I was like, this is already here. When I came back for Easter, and I was like, this is on the shelf. That's when I put two and two together. But this is the earliest example of a Brautigan, the name Richard Brautigan being around me in my life, I would say. So I read this book. Jim Harrison, Thomas McGuane, almost arguably better friends with each other than with Brautigan. But he also lived in Livingston, Montana. When I went to bookstore in Livingston, they had a bunch of copies of signed editions by Jim Harrison. He only passed away in the last 10 years. And he's written a lot of books. And I don't know if this is the best one. I don't know if this is a starting point. But it is, in my opinion, I enjoyed this a lot more than Thomas McGuane. This is a story. Those guys both grew up in Michigan. This takes place in Michigan, so it's very Midwest, and I really enjoyed it for that. But it's very everyday rural life. It takes place in the 1950s, but it could easily have been the 1970s when this book was published. It could easily be today. A lot of these just small town characters who feel very realistic. And we follow this guy who, his name is Joseph in this time. I need to switch it up. He's a school teacher, he's a farmer, and he's in a bit of a love triangle, but it's the weirdest love triangle you've ever heard of. He's got a girlfriend, a longtime girlfriend that he's known since he was a teenager. This guy, he's like in his 40s, named Rosalie. They are not married. Her husband died a couple years earlier, and so they rekindled catching up. But they've always, it always seems like they're going to end up together. So why haven't they? Well, he can't commit. He doesn't want to. And he found out, he's a teacher. He teaches writing lessons. He teaches in the schoolhouse. One of his students, him and them have a thing together. And so you get to read about that. So if you want to read a story about a 43-year-old man and a 17-year-old girl who doesn't act or sound like a 17-year-old, or by descriptions look like one, now you understand why I don't think this is a good back cover. I'm sure this is his daughter or something like that, but I don't think this is a cover with a picture you want on your back of your book. So if you don't want to read that kind of story, which I don't blame you, I'm not against reading something like that. I think this was trying to be like a Lolita, but it's really not. The writing in here is very good. It's nowhere near like a Nabokov level of great writing that redeems actions. And of course, I think for as good as the characters are, the characters around that specific relationship, the fact that this 43-year-old man is just like kind of helpless to the allure of this woman, this girl, is ridiculous. And the fact that she can kind of like act in this like really controlling way, it's unrealistic and it's weird, and it's weird to perpetuate that's like how things should be, because that's not how they go in real life, and that's not how you should expect things to go in real life. Outside of that, like I said, the descriptions in here, there's a lot of stuff about hunting that has like nothing to do with the love triangle aspect. Stuff about just guy hanging out in a rural Michigan bar. Super great. Those are great descriptions, great chapters. I want to read something else from Jim Harrison that's not this. I don't know why this was at my parents'. I asked my parents, which one of you was the one who got this book, and I thought it would be my dad, just because I thought, it just kind of gears more towards a male lens. But it was my mom who had bought this book, and I don't think she didn't really offer me much more beyond that. It probably has been decades since she read it. Overall, like I said, this one, specific edition, I don't know if this is the best thing. Going back to the Brautigan quote, I do understand what he means. Brautigan was definitely someone who, bit of an interesting guy in himself. So maybe I don't know what he means, but I do think that there's a sensitivity. I don't know if it's a powerful love story. And I definitely get the human element of a lot of this stuff, because a lot of these characters, you get a lot of the internal struggle of just this man, not necessarily about the love stuff, but about him being at his age of 40, and he dreams of more. He doesn't want to just be a farmer. The opening little section in here is about a couple out on the West Coast, because he keeps talking about how he wants to see the ocean, and it's very clear that it's like kind of a description of a guy like him, like a Midwest farmer who's on vacation, and just that detail. There's a lot of great writing in this. It really captures like the little elements in a way that a Brautigan would. I think really, if I had to describe it, this guy is the in-between between Thomas McGuane and Richard Brautigan. He's got the personal, emotional element, but he's also got like the hard, the masculine kind of realism that you don't really get as much with a Brautigan, even though he's kind of talking about a lot of the same things too. That's it for Harrison. And finally, what we are going to talk about, the last author of today. I wanted to keep this a little short, so I didn't want to read everything. Because it'll go on forever. I mean, I'm already going forever. This is Hard Rain Falling by Don Carpenter, who we're going to talk about. This is probably the book that, if you're watching this video, you've probably heard of this. Outside of this, you probably are more familiar with this than Richard Brautigan or any of these other authors. In the last 15 years or so, this really has had a revival ever since it was produced by, republished by NYRB. It's very hard to find a copy now. This has been on my list since longer than I've known about Richard Brautigan and read from him. Don Carpenter, he's someone, like I said, has been on my radar for a while now. Finally found a copy of this book only a couple months ago because it's so hard to find. And it lives up to the hype. I'm not going to go too in detail because otherwise this could be its own video. This book here, people have described it as having like a Dostoevskian feel. And at the time I was like, I don't understand this. How can a guy who wrote like in 1960s America really have that feel? But it does. It is a really interesting and off-kilter story, the way it's told, the structure of it. That's not to say it's hard to follow along. It definitely leans towards a reread, but you can also get not everything, but you get a vast majority of it on first read. We start here in 1940s Portland, Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest, which is another theme with Brautigan, having grown up in Washington, and he lived on the West Coast in that Pacific Northwest area and wrote a lot of his stories. You think about Confederate general, you really get a lot of similar feel to it. And so this is not autobiographical, but it's definitely influenced by a lot of Carpenter and beyond. We start with, in the first 100 pages, these young guys, these young teenagers, and the perspective shifts around a lot, so you don't really know who we're really following until later. You could almost argue that some of the other characters are more main characters than our main character. And what comes of that is these guys, they're just hanging around, they're shooting pool, they're placing bets, they're really just like, any way I can get quick, fast money, they're dreaming of a better life, and they get into some trouble, they do some reckless things, they're out looking for girls, they're out breaking into houses, they're drinking, they're just roughhousing, doing whatever. And that's a cool story in itself, just that kind of era. You get this young black character who you get to kind of learn a little bit more about, like pre-civil rights era Oregon and how that was, like just discrimination in general. You think about a pre-civil rights time period, no matter where in the country, not a good time for black people. So you get a little bit more of that discrimination, that head-on racism kind of stuff. But after 100 pages, it switches up, and we skip about 10 years into the future or so, and our main character, why am I not remember any of their names? Jack is, he ends up being kind of more the main character. We get a little bit of him in the beginning. He's a little bit down and out. He's an orphan, but aside from that, you really don't get much. He's not really the most exciting or even like main focus of the book. Then we get into, he goes to prison. He has a couple of bad moves, and the next 100 pages is just spending it in prison. And so you get explorations on the prison system. You get just man in solitude. And a big conversation of this book is the nature versus nurture argument. Is it nature or nurture that really develops human behavior and the actions of people? It's interesting. It's told to you, and there's a lot of these ponderings, but it's never like a philosophical just quandering. It is still part of the narrative, and it's pretty great in that. He meets up with the character who I had mentioned earlier, Billy, gosh, I forget these names so easily. Billy, our character, who is the young black teen, he's a much bigger hustler in the pool hall scene. They both run into each other in jail. They end up being cellmates. And what comes of that is, it's a lot of the quandaries of that too. Man in isolation, physical, sexual emotions, and if that, does that build to anything more? What is that? What is love? All that kind of stuff. It's really interesting because it is a book published in 1966, and it's rare that you would even hear a lot of that stuff discussed today in a modern book. The last 100 pages or so is Jack on the outside, out of prison. He's in San Francisco, and he's trying to live a better life. He's on parole, and what comes of that is he runs into this girl Sally, Jack and Sally, just like the John Cougar Mellencamp song. How creative all these guys with their creative names. Am I right? This book did come out before the song, but what comes of that is they get together, and she's someone who is from a much more affluent, higher standard of living. She's had a previous husband who's a famous actor. She hangs around with guys with a lot more money than him, and he's just a guy trying to get by. He's working at he's a parking lot attendant, barely making a living, just trying to live a better life, trying to get out of this. Doesn't want to continue the cycle. And she's allured to his bad boy image of being an ex-con and being on the outside and all that kind of stuff. and it's really just them at odds, and the fact they really aren't meant for each other, but in all odds they go together. They have a kid, and it kind of, I don't want to spoil too much of the ending, but it gets dismal, and it just kind of shows a lot of what comes of just living life, just brutal realities of life, and it's definitely a sad book. It'll be a top read of the year. It lives up to the hype, like I said. A lot of people have hyped this book online in the last 15 years, and it's well worth reading if you can get your hands on a copy of it. Now, it's interesting with Brautigan, if I were to think about it. A lot of these themes, because there are so many human emotions in this book is told very differently. This is a very, once again, Don Carpenter was a guy who did a lot of screenplays and did a lot of stuff in Hollywood. Arguably, that's more of what he's known for. And this book feels very cinematic at times, very action film, very gangster film kind of stuff. Prison film for sure, like Shawshank Redemption, you kind of visualize that all throughout the prison. And it's just like, that's very different than the Brautigan style. But a lot of the emotion of these characters, like I could imagine in the mid-'60s, these guys were hanging out together, Don Carpenter and Richard Brautigan. I could imagine if Don Carpenter in some other reality was like, hey, I got this idea for a book. I don't know if I can write it though. And he handed the notes to Richard Brautigan. He would still write a great book that would cover the human emotion of it. It would be a very different book. But I think I would love to see that in that alternate universe where he writes the book. Because I could imagine him doing it. And so I bring up Don Carpenter. I got a couple of his other books up here. I wanted to read this one before the video, but I felt like I would talk forever if I did. Fridays and Enrico is a posthumous book that came out about 10 years ago. And this is kind of a take on just describing Brautigan and Don Carpenter and all the friends hanging out in the bars. But it's published posthumously. I don't know how good it is. It seems like if I was going to read one Don Carpenter, Hard Rain Falling is the one to read. About 2 months ago, I found this for very cheap, A Couple of Comedians by Don Carpenter, which is one of his LA books. And I think this is more about the studio world, because it's for $4. And I do want to read this one. I don't know anyone who really talks about any of these Don Carpenter books aside from Hard Rain Falling, but it's cool to have found something different, and especially the old hardcover edition. I'm going to leave it at that with talking about all this. Like I said, I want to read the Jubilee Hitchhiker, the biography by Hjortsberg. I want to read a couple of these other books, and maybe I'll come back with it and talk about just kind of how Brautigan continued, kind of the continued influence of him and his friends. I think that, like I said, this has been an interesting reading project. I thought it was a great way to understand a different period of literature. There's so many correlations you could tie together, and you can kind of see where they influence each other, where that kind of stylistic just ethos was created. It's really interesting, and learning. It feels like a more vivid take on history and a vivid take on a friendship to read in this way. I want to do this with a couple other authors. It's not the easiest thing to find out. I think Brautigan, because he had so many friends who were writers, it's a lot easier to understand and to get. But it's a great way to explore an author, and I would highly recommend it with one of your favorites if you're able to do so. And yeah, I'll leave it at that because I don't know what else to say. Have a good one. Bye.